Okay, here we are. Hello there. In this video, I want to talk about some really in-depth Smite theory related to protections, to penetration and reduction within the game. I'm going to say there's probably going to be a lot of maths involved in this video. Well, I wouldn't say a lot, but there's going to be some maths involved, at least at the start. If you're not into that, I'm going to talk near the end of the video about some of the realistic applications of this sort of theory that I've derived and try and describe what the real impact of it is. First things first, I want to cover the basics of how protections work in the game. It's one of the fundamental mechanics and it's fairly simple. All characters in the game have a protection stat, or they have two protection stats. They have physical and they have magical protections that are increased over time by either leveling or through building items. So most characters gain a couple of protections per level, and items generally give tier 3 items usually give between 50 and 80 protections, somewhere around that line per item. And this protection value is used in a calculation that ultimately reduces any incoming damage that you would take. The calculation for the damage taken is your incoming damage, that's the damage you would receive, multiplied by 100 divided by 100 over your protections. So it's the incoming damage multiplied by a fraction, and this fraction is created by your protection value. The strength of this fraction is controlled by your protection value. So from this formula we can see that any damage taken is reduced by a percentage, so you can say a fraction is also a percentage on something, and therefore we can say that the protections in Smite give your character a theoretical percentage damage mitigation. This damage mitigation, this percentage mitigation, is completely different and separate from the percentage mitigation buffs that already exist within the game. You're talking items like Spirit Robe or Oni Hunter's Garb or Osiris's passive, which provide separate buffs which reduce all incoming damage taken. This theoretical percentage damage mitigation is just from their protections, and it doesn't really interact with anything else. It's just a nice way of seeing the strength of items. So mathematically we can say that protections are proportional to a percentage mitigation they provide, and we can graph that. And what I've got out here on the screen is actually that graph, and it's taken me several months to build it to the level that it's at now. This graph is going to be the focus of the video, and I really want to talk about how it works, what it means, and I think most importantly how you can use it to compare the effectiveness of different items and different builds directly in terms of their damage potential. This is outside of any other factors, like you might want the passive of an item, or even disregards the power. This is just the raw damage that you would get from building an amount of penetration or protection reduction, and it helps you answer questions quite quickly, like should I build Spear of the Mages here, or is Obsidian Shard just better? Which item gives me more damage overall? So labelled on the graph are the protections that you might have, ranging from 0 to 325 on the x-axis. So we've got 0 here, and then we've got 325 over here. It's nicely labelled. And on the y-axis of the graph, we have the percentage mitigations, which are actually relative to the amount of penetrations or reductions that you might have applied. That last part is important. In the damage taking formula I spoke about a second ago, the protection value used is actually your protections after all penetrations and reductions have been applied. So the incoming damage can actually be increased by building penetration. So as a baseline, I've set up some guides on the boundaries of the graph. So we have just one at the end here, which just marks the end of protections. And probably the most important part is this sort of black curve that we've got going on here. So this black curve is what I like to call the true mitigation line. And it represents what a target's mitigation would be if you didn't have any penetration. So it represents the mitigation without penetration. And so by comparing different builds to this curve here, we can actually see the effectiveness of a build against either a target with high protections, maybe a target with mid-range, or a target with low-range protections. And we can immediately assess how effective that item would be. With all that said, about the graph, I just want to take a step back and talk about another fundamental mechanic related to protections. That is the order of penetrations in Smite and what the penetrations actually do. So most people usually know the order of penetrations. They maybe just sort of memorized it by watching video after video about it or something like that. I don't know. That's how I initially learned it. A lot of people don't actually understand why it is the way that it is, and I'll be describing that very shortly. So there are two methods to deal with the target's protections in the game, and the first is building penetration, and the second is building protection reduction. So penetration is its own stat that every character has in the game, and you can increase that stat by building items which give you penetration, or using abilities which give you penetration. And it causes any damage that you deal to ignore a portion of the target's current protection value. The keyword being that current protections, which is the value of the protection you might see in the corner of your screen. And that's going to relate into the next part, which is reduction, which is a bit trickier. It's not its own stat in the game. You don't build protection reduction. You apply a debuff, and protection reduction is always applied in the form of a debuff to a target. And this debuff immediately reduces the target's, I guess you could say, base protections. That's base as in all of their protections added up to the maximum. It reduces their protections by some amount, and after that reduction, it's used as the target's current protections. What it means is that the protection reduction is always applied first, and then it's followed by the application of your penetrations. So the order is first reductions and then penetrations. And then each of the penetration and reduction has two forms that it can come in. So you can either have a flat amount of reduction or penetration, or you can have a percentage amount of reduction or penetration. And to maximize the overall total penetration that you would get, as the percentages generally apply first. So it leaves us with the order percentage reduction, which reduces the target's overall protections by a percentage of what they have. Then you have flat reduction, which then reduces those protections by a flat amount. It's then followed by percentage penetration, which causes you to ignore a percentage of that reduced amount. And then finally flat penetration, which is applied last and causes you to ignore just a flat amount of whatever protections they have left. So now that we understand how protections and penetrations interact with each other in the game, we can actually begin testing the effectiveness of different items against all forms or against all levels of protections. So to start, I'm going to use a really simple example of flat penetration in effect, because flat penetration is generally the first form that you build in a game. What we're going to see from the graph is that flat penetration works really well early on and then just loses its value completely as the game progresses. And we're going to build Brawler's Beatstick, which gives you 15 flat physical penetration. So to do that, we open up this folder here on the left hand side called Penetration Controls, and it's labeled as P, and we'll set that to 15, and we'll close that folder again just to keep things nice and tidy. And then to see that the curve that building that 15 flat penetration would produce, we enable the flat penetration line. and that's this green line that's just showed up on the graph here. So I'm actually going to bring this black guide down to sort of really see what I'm talking about here when we say that flat penetration is an early game statistic. So what happens here is that we have this sort of black line is at the 30 protection mark. It's not clearly visible, see if we can zoom out a bit. Yeah, so it's between 20 and 40. So this represents what this black line here that's vertical represents a target at 30 protections. So without any penetration, without our Brawler's Beat Stick, that target would mitigate 23% of all incoming damage. With the Brawler's Beat Stick applied, they only mitigate 13% of all incoming damage. So we can actually say that the 23% minus the 13%, that gives us 10% damage increase. That tells us that against a target with 30 protections, building 15 flat penetration is directly a 10% damage increase, which if you aren't aware is like building a full Shaman's Ring and having its passive immediately. 10% damage increase is really nothing to laugh at. So the next thing I want to talk about is, before we get on to the big boys of the video, Obsidian Shard and Titan's Bane, I want to talk about percentage reduction, because I want to talk about how Executioner works in the game. It is sort of the main percentage reduction item in the game. It's the one you're going to see the most often. So what it does is it gives you 12% percentage reduction up to 3 stacks. So it's for a total of 36%. And we're going to set that value here to 36%. And we can have a look at that item's curve. That's rolling all the way back down. Here we are, percentage reduction, which is another green line. So the percentage reduction has, I guess, a fairly linear damage increase overall. You can see that this gap stays relatively constant throughout, with the exception of some early game values where the difference is really marginal. And in fact, you're only going to want to build Executioner when targets start having more than about 50 or 60 protections. That's when the item really begins to shine in terms of its damage output, which is actually reasonable. By the time you get Executioner built in a game, you're going to have some form of lifesteal build, because you're going to build on a Hunter. You're either going to have either a Devourer's Gauntlet or a Transcendence built, a sort of power bank or lifesteal item. You're then going to have to build your boots, and then followed by your Executioner, because at that point in the game the enemy supports are likely going to have something like Sovereignty or Gauntlet of Thebes, which provide protection auras to their teams. So even the squishier targets have a healthy amount of protections on them, and you'll typically see about 40 or 50 protections on those targets, and that's when building Executioner starts to get some value, which is why you usually see it either right after boots or the item after boots. And it sort of keeps its value throughout the whole of the in-game against most targets. It is just generally overall a really good DPS item, because even without the penetration, it provides a solid amount of attack speed and power for its cost. I think it's only 22.50 or 23.50 these days. It's really cheap. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the big boy of the video, which is Titan's Bane and Obsidian Shard. So a quick history lesson. These items used to provide a flat amount of percentage penetration when you built them. They both gave you 33% percentage penetration, which would mean that you ignore a third of a target's protections, after the reductions. Which it tells you, okay, build this item against tanks. That was pretty simple. They were redesigned in Season 5, at the beginning of Season 5, right at the very start, along with a bunch of other redesigns that came in, where they start at a lower percentage penetration, but they scale up to gain even more if the target has more protections. So this scaling starts at 20% for Titan's Bane and 15% for Obsidian Shard. and both these items begin to increase that percentage when the target has more than 65 or 40 protections respectively, and that goes up all the way to a maximum of 40% penetration at 200 protections, and that's for both items. So this sort of scaling effect is what led me to do some theory, because it was clear that these items would be really effective against tanky targets, but against a lot of sort of mid-range bruiser builds, you're never quite sure if these items are truly as effective as you need them to be. So it's hard to decide. So I wanted to decipher that and sort of work out, you know, is it right to build this item in this situation? And shocker, it generally is. These items are actually quite cheap. Titansbane isn't as huge, but Obsidian Shard definitely is an item that you really do want to see in most builds. They do absolutely nothing for low values of protections, but past even about 100 protections, these items really ramp up hard with the amount of damage that they give you. So we're going to have a look at the curves just quickly to finish up what I've seen about Titansbane, just to sort of confirm what I've been saying about them. So these are the curves for Titansbane and Obsidian Shard. And you can see that, yeah, up to about 100 they're doing basically nothing, and then they start to really scale, and this gets wider and wider and wider, and you get up to, I think it's 10% for Titansbane and then 12% for Obsidian Shard. And in fact, the biggest gap, the biggest damage increase is actually at this 200 mark, interestingly enough. So I'll move it, oh, that's the wrong slider. We'll move it to 200. And we can see that we go from 66% to 54%, so it's 12% for Titansbane and 14% for Obsidian Shard. So definitely against the sort of mid-range bruiser tank builds that you see, Obsidian Shard and Titansbane are items you really want. And you're seeing two of those tanks every game. They may not be warriors or guardians, you might see a solo lane mage or solo lane assassin, but those characters also are able to get up to this 200 protection mark. So these really are items that you want, especially in the later stages of the game, but not so much early on. Typically you want to build flat penetration early on and then transition into percentage penetration. So far we've only looked at single items, and that's not really realistic. You're always really combining penetration items to get the most effective form of damage that you can. Sometimes you might need a Divine Rune or Brawler's Beat Stick for that anti-heal effect, and other times you don't. It's in those times that you don't that you really want to understand how to maximize your damage output. When you really need to kill a target, you need to know how to kill them as fast as possible. So the first situation I want to talk about is one that we saw pop up a whole lot of worlds this year, which was the combination of Spear the Magus and Obsidian Shard. And we saw a lot of hate being directed towards the professional players. And I'm going to tell you that that was unjust, mathematically, because of the way penetration and reduction, or percentage penetration and reductions interact within the game. So the percentage penetration takes a percentage of the target's current protections, and those current protections are in fact affected by the reductions. So what you do is you would reduce the value and then take a percentage of that, which reduces the percentage that you would take, leading to some inefficiencies when building reductions alongside Obsidian Shard and Titansbane. So typically you would see people getting all worked up about building Executioner and Titansbane together, and now we're seeing people getting worked up about building Spear the Magus and Obsidian Shard together. We're going to look at the curve for theoretically the best possible situation for Obsidian Shard and Spear the Magus. I'm going to bring that up here because, oh my, this is a beautiful curve. I just love seeing it. So Spear the Magus is 15 flat pen, and it is a 50 flat reduction at all 5 stacks. And we'll just enable the line Obsidian Shard with flat reduction and penetration. Would you look at that damage increase? It is massive. Realistically, this doesn't exist because you're outside of playing characters like Anubis. You're never going to get 5 ticks of damage off and then hit them with a big hit, or continue to hit them very hard. And Anubis has never been meta. At least I don't think he has. So we don't expect to see that in our professional games anytime soon. Actually, just out of curiosity, Anubis's passive also gives him 21 reduction, so that brings it up to 71. So this is Anubis's curve, which is probably why you see him do so much damage in casual games. But let's look at a more realistic scenario. One scenario I like to talk about is Nox. Nox has the combo of Siphon Darkness into Shadow Lock. So you throw out the silence. After a few seconds, the silence explodes, and to get that silence damage off, you cast Shadow Lock, which roots the target in place if you actually hit the ability, and keeps them inside that silence. The only way to get out of it is if you have some form of CC immunity, such as beads, or maybe a Magi's Blessing, and you get out in time. So that combination actually only ever gets off 2 ticks of Spear of the Mages, 2 ticks of damage. A similar combination might be Apwash, where he throws at the corpses, he throws at the dot, or vice versa, he throws at the dot and then throws at the corpses and then explodes them all in your face and kills you. Each separate instance of explosion applies a stack, as well as the initial upfront throw out the corpses does as well. So Apwash can actually get those 5 stacks relatively easily. It does provide a huge curve here. But for Nox, you only ever get 2 stacks. Unless you're in melee range and you're playing an instant cast, you can get sometimes 3 stacks, but you can only ever get 2. And you generally see 2. And this is the curve for that. And you can see against all forms of defense, it provides more than 10% damage increase. It provides on average about 15 to 20% more damage, even with just 2 stacks. And which is why we saw those items built, and why I'll continue to support people who build these 2 items together until this is changed, which it likely will be changed. Change for the sake of change. We'll see what Titan Forge Games has in store for us. The next thing I'm going to talk about is Executioner and Titan's Bane, which is nothing new, but when it was kind of new, we were seeing people say the same things that they are saying now about Obsidian Shard and Spear of the Mages. So this is the curve for Titan's Bane, which is fairly well, we've already seen it, and this is the curve for Executioner, and I think we've already seen that as well. This is the curve for Titan's Bane and Executioner together, and it's not as nice as the Spear of the Mages combo, but it is definitely good. It's massive damage increases against all targets, with the exception of targets with less than 40 protections. Realistically speaking, you're never going to hit a target with 40 protections with this build, because you're going to have Titan's Bane and Executioner, both items you want to build late. By the time you have both these items online, the game is going to be just about over, and this really is sort of min-maxing the end game fighting potential of your build. So you will see targets about 60 plus protections, and you will get the benefit of these 2 items together. So generally you build, in your Hunter build, you go your Power Bank, you go your Boots, then you might go Executioner, and then you have a choice between either kin size or crit. And then if you go kin size, you build more attack speed to get the kin size even better, and if you go crit, you go even more crit to make the crit proc even more. And then finally, your very last item, which you'll probably be replacing your starter item with, is Titan's Bane, and it should probably always be Titan's Bane. There is probably no reason for it to not be Titan's Bane, outside of you really don't want to die and you need a Magi's Blessing, something like that. Yeah, so let's just have a look at this curve on its own, and we can, just so we can appreciate it. At 200 protection mark, it is a 23% damage increase overall. And I think that's everything I wanted to talk about. One last thing is what I like to call the Shaman's Ring curve, which is just the same as this black line, and minus 10%. So it allows us to compare what Shaman's Ring is like against other magical penetration items, and we'll compare it with Obsidian Shard just for a quick giggle. At 136 protections, Obsidian Shard just becomes more damage than a fully built Shaman's Ring. This is why we don't see Shaman's Ring really ever built. It is a powerful item, but it is also almost 3,000 gold with a passive that has to be stacked, and the damage potential of it just is not significant enough. Like, Shaman's Ring is beat by Spear of the Magus in the early game, and it's completely beaten by Obsidian Shard in the late game. There is almost no reason for you to really ever build this item unless you expect the game to go late and you expect to be able to stack it and it fits in with your build. Maybe you need some more movement speed to avoid abilities. Maybe you're playing Chronos or something like that who already has a ton of movement speed. You just want to add to that sort of BM. With all of that being said, I'd like to know what the people who actually see this video think of it. I'll leave the graph sort of clean. I usually just save it like that with all the sliders turned down to 0. I usually leave the protection slider about 200. You can go into the formulas if you want. If you study mathematics, the Titan's Bane and Obsidian Shard are actually piecewise formulas for the separate sections. So it's before the scaling, during the scaling, and then after the scaling. And there are formulas, each with the different applications to your protections. So the Y coordinate is the mitigation, the X value is the protections, and there's some jank going on to sort of scale up to show as a percentage from 0 to 100 rather than as 0 to 1 and points. I've multiplied it by 100. There's also a lot of guidelines that you can turn off and on. Some of them I haven't enabled and some I haven't shown in the video. There's this mitigation slider, which instead of having a vertical line, you have a horizontal line that allows you to check where a percentage mitigation might be. So say you're looking for 40% mitigation, you know, that starts at 60 protections. No, is that no? 66 protections. Yeah. You can maybe play about with your own lines, maybe try and build your own things, see what builds are like, tell me what you think of it. I'm probably going to leave this video unlisted, but I'll leave a link to this graph in the description, and I'll also leave a link to the Word of Thoth by Flareboot in the description, which is a really good resource if you're looking to learn more about the game. It covers some of the basics about protections, but it also covers a whole lot of other in-depth stuff between tower scaling and minion scaling, as well as even your account level scaling. If you want to have a look at the graph at that, it's pretty hilarious the amount of time you have to invest to get to level 160. It's 3,000 hours plus at the bare minimum. It's pretty funny. Okay, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, which is going to be about kin size and Soul Reaver and why you need to stop building Soul Reaver early game. Like, seriously, build this item maybe 5th, maybe 6th. Thank you very much.